of U.S. IRF policy as a necessary aspect of America's foreign policy and engagement abroad. I hope that you will enjoy and take part in today's discussion. I would like to first introduce our distinguished speaker for today's conversation, Congressman Geoff Davis. Geoff is a former U.S. Congressman from the Commonwealth of having represented the 4th District in the United States House of Representatives from January 2005 until August 2012. During his tenure in Congress, he held a leadership role within the Republican Conference as a deputy whip, a close advisor to senior congressional leadership. Geoff served on the House Financial Services and Armed Services Committees from 2005 to 2008, and in 2009, he was appointed to the Powerful Ways and Means Committee, now the House National Security Interagency Reform Working Group. During his time in Congress, Geoff worked on policies related to conflict prevention and resolution. Moreover, since the Congress, he has participated in conferences and meetings with IGE related to advancing religion and reconciliation across the Middle East and South Asia. Geoff is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and is a former Army Ranger parachutist. Before we begin, I wanted just a few seconds to provide a brief description of today's call format. We will start with approximately 20 minutes of questions for and commentary from Geoff, followed by 40 minutes of questions from the audience. For the duration of the call, all participant lines will be placed on mute. If at any point during the call you have a question for Geoff, please press 5* and you will be placed in the queue. So, with that introduction, let's turn to our call. This afternoon, you are all here to hear Geoff's views on the historical and political context for thinking about what could go right and wrong over the next few years in regards to U.S. policy on religious freedom. In addition, the conversation will explore what the multi-faith, multi-party religious freedom community might hope for and what to brace ourselves for in terms of divided government during the last quarter of the Obama presidency. Geoff, welcome, and thank you for leading the discussion today and sharing your insights and expertise.
Well, it's great to be with you.
Well, we will just jump right into it and just ask if you could just briefly share with the audience your story and how you came to the IRF space as a former member of Congress.
Well, I began this journey in some ways quite a while ago. Back when I was in the Army, I actually ran flight operations or Army aviation operations for peace enforcement and the peacekeeping force between Israel and Egypt in a 17-nation coalition, and began to encounter firsthand on the ground different cultures, what I wouldn't call necessarily the clash of religions, but the intersection, sometimes in very complicated ways, often more cultural than spiritual. And it challenged a lot of the assumptions I had from my training and also academic study about the region. I was a fairly new Christian at the time as well, and I saw a lot of things that were, to put it mildly, different in operation and reality on the ground than what was being portrayed in the church back here at home. Long story short, many years in the future, 20 years in the future, I found myself in the United States Congress dealing with these various issues in the height of two wars and trying to navigate a solution to an effective foreign policy in the long term. And I guess probably one place that I can say is there are different schools of thought within the Congress. Probably the dominant view at the State Department and the dominant view in the Congress is implicitly a rational man model that's reasonably based on a secular understanding of the world. And one thing that I've always contended since my first experiences in the Middle East, and those have continued over a 30-year period now, is that it takes a person of faith to communicate most effectively with another person of faith. And that aspect of the dialogue was clearly missing. I think a lot of our policy inadvertently came across as ethnocentric in nature. When we would want to weigh in against religious persecution issues, there were rarely attempts at dialogue, and more often it was demagoguing that would go on, and that would harden positions of the very people that we had to deal with who were affecting fellow believers in Christ. And I found some of this frustrating through time in terms of outreach. There were certainly misunderstandings of various cultures and people. I'm a strong proponent of the gospel. I think my experience, in fact, with Chris, we found kindred spirits working at the first conference in Istanbul together. But I would put it into this final context. I hit a height of frustration on dealing with a number of policies in the Middle East, particularly the Israel-Palestine situation, to try to get parties talking about the context on the ground and how the view in the American church was actually abetting part of the problem indirectly in terms of perception over there and what limited perceptions there were here in the United States. And at that point, Todd Detheridge walked into my office with his friend Greg Khalil with Telos, began sharing a different message of dialogue and outreach that I found amazingly compelling. And then shortly after I left the Congress, Todd introduced me to a disciple who asked me if I might be interested in participating in a conference with post-Arab Spring Salafi political leaders. And frankly, I jumped at the chance because as we were going through the Arab Spring, the one thing that I and a small number of members of Congress pushing very hard for was to open dialogue with these emerging people and not stand necessarily only with the prior regimes that had been overthrown. And at the same time, not to abet taking, as we did in Libya, that frankly has created more problems than it's solved. And I think the baseline of this begins with dialogue. So my wife and I participated in the very first conference we did with IGE in Istanbul, sponsored by the Cordoba Institute and the Swiss Federal State Department in March of 2013. And I would say that it was a transformative experience. And with no hyperbole, I believe if many of my colleagues, my former colleagues, had the opportunity to participate in a dialogue like that 15 years ago, I think there's a good chance that much of the conflict that we've been part of would not have been necessary. And with that, I can just say I'm a committed believer. I think that it's in the hidden space that the greatest successes are going to be found, and I think IGE is onto something very important.
Very well said. Thank you. That definitely lays a great foundation for the rest of this conversation. So moving on, what then would be your sense of the future of U.S. IRF policy, given the new Congress, new IRF Ambassador, and then the recent proclamation by President Obama deeming January 16th International Religious Freedom Day?
I think the proclamations come and go, and presidents in both parties do them with some regularity. I think what really matters is the consistent sentiment and policy that goes behind them. Going into the new Congress, the one thing that I would emphasize more than anything else is the importance of building dialogue with members of Congress. And speaking as somebody who came in ignorant about many areas of policy, the one thing I can say is that the vast majority of new members in both parties, contrary to the stereotypes that we pick up in media, most of them are very successful people. They have a worldview that they try to operate consistently under, and they work very hard. But we also bring our assumptions about reality and false presuppositions with us. And in this particular case, the one thing that I think is left kind of blowing in the wind in both parties is a misunderstanding of religious dialogue. For example, Christianity is seen almost exclusively through an American filter, and I would say in some circles it comes across, and I say this as a very conservative Republican. So I want to put this into context. My politics and my policy views are very consistent with my worldview, but through this process, I also had to rediscover that being a follower of Jesus Christ is not determined by all of my policy positions. It's determined by my faith in Jesus and repentance of sin. And I don't say that lightly, but many of my colleagues and many of the policymakers and staffers writing policy viewed the latitude 1040 window between Western Africa and Southeast Asia, essentially where the height of these conflicts and dialogues are taking place. They viewed it through a lens of what could probably be called Christian American nationalism, almost kind of an identity religion that didn't see the unique reasons why certain things are flourishing in certain ways, or especially in addition to having an ignorance of the history leading up to the challenges in many of the current conflicts, which I think was so valuable for me, at least, having that both military and academic background coming into the Congress to understand some of the precursors. And my counsel to people would be, it's very, very important to build personal relationships with the policymakers and also in the influence community, that in the think tank community that writes papers, that is in media, going on broadcast TV, on cable news, as well as those who are close confidants of the members and senators themselves. And I think those personalities become very important in terms of shaping the dialogue.
Thanks. What a great response. You talked a little bit about, or you mentioned that you have this background that's both within the policy world but also outside of it. So how does U.S. foreign policy and military interventions, in your view, hamper or help our goals to achieve religious freedom and or decrease the amount of persecution of religious minorities worldwide?
Well, Speaker Boehner has an interesting saying. He used to use, mainly focused on domestic politics, but was in talking with younger members about trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. As my friend Jim Bunning, former senator, used to say, today's enemy may necessarily be tomorrow's friend on a policy issue. And Speaker Boehner liked to say, the more you're talking, the less you're shooting. I personally believe that the fundamental challenge policy-wise the United States faces is first a structural problem. The interagency process is broken. I worked intensively with that during my entire time in Congress. I'm still involved, on a kind of pro bono basis right now, trying to address that. But that communications mechanism to mistake-proof how we approach foreign policy, we've kind of taken a default to the Defense Department, and as one of my West Point alumni friends likes to say, it doesn't have to do with necessarily the top skill set, as the Defense Department has something that no other agency has. It has, first, the operational planning capability, and second, it has the logistical projection capability to put people and resources on the ground in remote areas and essentially set up a network of communication and municipal support. Really, we, and the military in particular, feel this most acutely. We need to change that orientation so that our first encounters are at the NGO and economic level. People like former Deputy Treasury Secretary Robert Kimmett feel very strongly that the key to our success in the future for national security begins with trade and investment policy, which ultimately gets down to relationships. And then from there, we work through the tiers of NGOs into related aid and communication organizations, the non-uniformed agencies like the State Department, USAID, groups like that, U.S. Institute of Peace, and then finally, as a last resort, the use of military force, and sometimes, or the military presence to secure it, but we often get that backwards. And make no mistake, I'm a proponent of force when it's appropriate, but we've seen in a number of our deployments of forces in multiple administrations a lack of consistency and context. And so that's the first part that I would say. The second thing is there's a kind of a rule of thumb in counterinsurgency or liberation that is, this may sound trite, but I've heard it said many times. Essentially, you've got 3 months to show the love. And what that means is that in an environment, in a post-conflict stabilization environment, that it's very critical for a restoration of civil society, some degree of rule of law, consistency in the lives of the people, and especially maintaining their existing structures, underpinning that. And when the military force, depending on how that's being directed, becomes a face, particularly in with Western media amplifying this, that we're doing God's will, or it's the Christian approach, or whatever media over here is, that gets amplified in those areas, and oftentimes is misunderstood and can hamper the mission. Whereas the most important thing becomes building long-term personal relationships. Part of the reason I give you an example of IGE's work in this space with these emerging Salafi leaders, just the exigencies of politics and the turbulence in some of these countries, some of those men may not be there or be involved any longer years down the road. But I think of people I know in the diplomatic community when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain fell, befriended, low-ranking backbenchers in the new parliaments. And, for example, some of those closest relationships now are with people like Angela Merkel, who was one of those back in 1992, but it engenders a space for open and transparent dialogue among key policymakers. And I think taking the long view, that's the most important thing to do. And I think we have to be very measured in our use of force. It has to be a defined objective and not so much trying to remake a culture into our image. And because that becomes fodder for any folks who are trying to oppose us or want to resent that. The other thing I'd say on the backside of that as well is what we're looking at from the outside is, in a sense, I believe, not a conflict against Islam, but a conflict within it. And how we choose to interact with that is going to go a long way towards, engendering success. And I think that, force, excessive force or continued force doesn't always have the best outcome.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned just in your response now, you mentioned the importance of relationships, and also we've talked about the importance of dialogue. In your opinion, your estimation, what is that role of dialogue in this space, and how can it be utilized effectively in formal and informal platforms when it comes to religious issues, especially in light of the growing threats from terrorism or extremism throughout the world?
Well, I think one of the things I would say in particular where, and again, I'm not patronizing IGE. There are a number of groups. Telos was an important, part of the space and dialogue as well, and a, narrow issue with Israel and Palestine. But the one thing that I would tell you is that it's harder under the official face of diplomacy to have these kinds of conversations because they're vetted conversations. People aren't necessarily able to speak freely because, in effect, they're operating under positional authority in the diplomatic or statutory mandates of their respective countries, whether it's us or the Chinese or the folks in Myanmar. And that in itself can create a tension. And I would put this into kind of perhaps a business context or even a family context for that matter. If a parent or a person in the family is having a conflict with somebody else, oftentimes the ability to have side conversations that aren't forcing that head-to-head tension can create a space where the actual problems can be rooted out and solved. And I think that it has to function on two levels. First, at what I would call the statutory level, it's very important for members, senators, policymakers to travel, certainly people in the agency community to travel. They don't not have a lot of interface. There needs to be more dialogue, operating dialogue between Capitol Hill and the State Department foreign desks, for example. But at the same time, especially with people in the Congress, my experience internationally has been that a meaningless resolution brought to the House floor, passed on a suspension vote with, 425 votes or whatever on a Monday night before everybody races out, after the 5-minute vote is over for dinner, can be interpreted as cataclysmic in another country where they think the United States is taking some kind of action or position that in no way reflects United States policy and might actually be being done to support a local domestic political constituency. And this happens all the time. What I've encouraged members to do particularly is not only to travel and meet with, let's say, formal sanctioned meetings that are being set up through the formal or positional diplomatic community, but being able to have meetings with other actors as well, and then have facilitators that are, in a sense, going between them. But I think the real power, though, well, that is operating, and that has to be in place as a show of credibility. I think it's very important for the relationship-building side where folks who are not in those statutory positions can build relationships that engender dialogue, whether it's somebody in the international business community, whether it's a person working under the auspices of an organization like IGE who can become a trusted point of dialogue, and then between those two, facilitate dialogues at an informal level. If you look at how the Cold War actually ended, not a lot of folks are aware of it, but there was a group called the Pugwash Organization that began in the 1970s, and it was started by a group of nuclear scientists of all things, but quietly reached out to facilitate dialogue between Soviet bloc counterparts and essentially NATO bloc counterparts. That expanded gradually to the point of trust that diplomat and elected officials from the West and political officials from the Soviet Union were involved. The output of that laid the space, frankly, by the time we got to the Reagan-Gorbachev era, to have some stunning agreements to roll back from a nuclear deterrence standpoint, to roll back that threat. And it wasn't simply the outward treaty that President Reagan said it's credit for in the 1980s. It was actually started by informal non-governmental groups, sort of a nuclear version of IGE that was working behind the scenes. And so if you take a holistic view of it, it becomes very important in the long term to start building what I would call those new dialogues. And oftentimes the official channels are talking to the wrong people in the country, which doesn't help.
You're absolutely right there. Well, Geoff, you've set such a great stage for further conversation. I'm sure there will be lots of questions coming your way. So I think now we'll open the lines for caller questions. As a reminder, as the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please press 5 star. And when it is your turn to ask your question, the call administrator will announce your name and unmute your line so that you may ask it. Lines will be placed on mute following the asking of a question. If your question has been asked or you no longer wish to ask your question, please press 5 star a second time, and your name will be erased from the queue. And for the sake of other callers, especially on this call, I will ask that when you're called upon, try to immediately ask your question, limiting any commentary as much as possible. So with that, I will turn it over to our administrator.
Thank you, Ms. Vines. Our first question today comes from Ms. Hien Vu. Hien, go ahead and ask your question, please. Hien, you have been unmuted on this end, so go ahead and unmute yourself on your end, and you can go ahead and ask your question. All right, seems like we're having some technical difficulty with this question, so I will put you back on mute. And we currently don't actually have any other questions in the queue, so participants, please.
We could always go to some people out in the parking lot on cell phone calling in. So.
Okay, I see one now. All right, Mr. Mike Waite, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Congressman, Rangers lead the way. Thanks for your time today. You mentioned early on in your comments that the American church is in some form, I think, abetting, you said, some of the problems we have with our understanding of Israel and the Middle East. Could you develop that thought a little more, please?
Yes, particularly when you talk to Christians in the West Bank areas, this comes out in spades. But I can give you an example of limited messaging. I think seeing things on the ground in context becomes much more valuable. But in order to get to any type of effective peace agreement, there has to be a dialogue based on agreed upon facts. And I'd share one example, just shooting from the hip here, that comes to mind. There's a TV network called God TV on cable that was raising money through some Christian programming, and to my knowledge, quite innocently, but it was being raised for an organization in Israel to plant trees in the desert. That money was actually being taken directly and being used to subsidize the plowing of villages and olive trees in the Negev Desert, southwest of Beersheba, in the Bedouin areas, where the Bedouin are constitutionally supposed to be protected, and then eucalyptus trees were being planted in that space, both removing the economic viability of those folks and essentially moving them into a mandated enclave or township. And to press that point home, I brought when Todd Detheridge actually had brought this to my attention, I invited a group of these Bedouins who were in North America at the time to come to Capitol Hill and have a dinner with several leaders in Congress who were, frankly, stunned because they had never been briefed on any of this at all and had no idea of some of the under-conflicts that were going on or really the longer-term history of the issue. And as someone who lived in Israel and cares about Israel very much, things like that become a sticking point, and in particular when it's money that's coming from the American church that's doing something that's effectively contrary to biblical principles, the outcome, I think, is pretty certain.
Thank you, Geoff. Our next question comes from Ms. Julie Bodner with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Julie, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I have looked at the issue of the International Religious Freedom Caucus in Congress, and what do you see as the prospects for this caucus being revitalized in the new Congress? I say that particularly because one of the key staffers for Congressman Trent Franks has left to go to an NGO not dealing with religious freedom. Do you have any ideas as to who might be champions? And obviously Frank Wolf has also left Congress. Who might be champions for religious freedom in Congress for the new Congress?
I would look to some of the names that aren't necessarily as prominent nationally, but who are, in terms of Christian media, who are very, very strong Christians and strong proponents of dialogue. You know, one that would come to mind in the U.S. House would be Congressman Charles Bustani, who's a subcommittee chairman on the Ways and Means Committee. He's very committed to dialogue, and in fact, I could tell this story now that we're well past it, but essentially he was the go-between between President Senior in Lebanon and the Prime Minister of Israel during the Lebanese War in August of 2006, who finally carried the messages back and forth that ultimately led to the ceasefire. And he became a point of credibility trying to convey a pragmatic message between the two that made him an effective peacemaker. And there are no op-eds written about him or books written about him, but we were literally on the cusp of tragedy in Lebanon, and he's an example of that type of person. I would think that you want to make that tent as broad as possible, from folks that might fall into a line of policy positions like Trent does, across the board to any number of other members, and particularly reaching out to new members in both parties.
Great, thank you, Geoff. So our next question, I don't actually have a name affiliated, but here is the number. So if you are calling in from 301-358-2370, your line has been unmuted, and feel free to ask your question.
Yes, I apologize for that. This is Isaac Six with International Christian Concern. And my question real quick for Mr. Davis, this is very close to the question that was just asked, but you mentioned building relationships with new members. Do you have any particular advice on the best way to open doors with new members on these issues, aside, of course, from finding members who may already be naturally inclined to cover them? Any particular approaches that you would recommend?
Well, I think that there's two levels that you have to do this on. One is, and it takes time and an investment of resources certainly, but I think that the first thing to do is getting to know the staffers who are involved. Being a member of Congress especially, but really in both chambers, is a great job if you have attention deficit disorder, because your life is broken up into 15-minute increments for about 14 hours a day. And so finding who the principal staffer is on social issues and or international affairs is an important place. For example, I never would have met Todd Dethridge or Chris Seipel had it not been for an outreach to my national security staff, and who was so convinced, he's a 26-year Special Forces officer, he was so convinced that I needed to take this meeting, which I didn't want to, that I should sit down and talk to these guys. And so building an inside coach becomes a very important part of that, and you have to gauge it from there on the next level. I think it's important to be able to reach out at a personal level, and that takes some time. There are two ways to do that. One is if probably more my case, where I embraced some folks and I called them with a regular basis and tried to work with them as closely as possible because I was passionate about what they were doing. You're going to find members that will fall into that category. And then there's others that it's going to take some time to cultivate and understand really what their personal priorities are, what their walk is, what they believe, what the constituencies are they represent, to see kind of a reflection of their worldview. And honestly, one of the best ways to get the personal time to talk and build relationships is in the wealth of political events that take place in Washington, D.C. I as a member, and raising money, sadly, is one of those things that all organizations have to do, especially in this modern political age. It's kind of a full-time business. But inside those dinners that I would have with people that had different policy concerns, I learned a vast amount of information. And I actually made some friends that I still have out of that, not because of the nature of the transactional nature of the dinner. It had more to do with connecting around sets of issues. And so there are both tracks as possibilities for that. And I think that finding ways that you can help a member move into a position to take a stand on an issue and build that trust with them becomes very important. I joke with some liaison programs that I helped start in the defense community, and we called it Adopt a Congressman. And the goal is to be able to have that person, when they get into that member, when they become more senior and they have a question on something, that your cell phone is the one they're going to call, as you've been moving up in your world as well. And so it's time on the ground as much as anything else. It's like community policing. And I think that you get some real breakthroughs. I want to say one other thing, too. The thing that really surprised me through this process was the coalitions that get built among members of different political views who suddenly find they have a common basis of faith. And, I would say, in this line, starting down this road, as I was looking at religious freedom issues, I suddenly began looking at certain aspects of the civil rights movement in a way that I never had before, at least experientially. I became very, very good friends with John Lewis from Georgia, the former freedom rider. And many of our domestic policy priorities are kind of different, but we became really good friends. We worked together on a host of issues that didn't violate either of our, sets of principles in terms of how we approach domestic policy. And we passed some landmark legislation on our subcommittee on Ways and Means. And it was, largely I credit him with helping me build that broader coalition. And so what you start in that dialogue on religious freedom can lead to other things, and building networks of folks who are talking together that can easily adapt to your priorities as well, and find a way to build common ground and common cause. Because unfortunately, a lot of the what I would call propaganda in the church, whether it's what you might call the mainline church or the evangelical church, spends more time doing the devil's work, dividing and talking about how we're different, rather than focusing on common ground in faith or common ground in Christ. And so those dialogues I think are essential. The joke among some of us was, oh yeah, we discovered there are some Baptists who are Christians too. There are some there are some Greek Orthodox who are Christians too. And I'm meaning it in the sense of having a faith in Christ, and yes, there were doctrinal differences. And where that extends is, once there's that common ground of faith, it becomes very easy to approach other cultures and other religions and speak from the position of your faith, and not from a secular set of assumptions, which I think is more credible.
Thank you, Isaac, for your question, and Mr. Davis for your answer. Our next question is going to come from Professor Barb Flanagan. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
First, thank you for doing this. My question is about what you perceive the level of support to be in Congress for international religious freedom. Since the act has been passed in the late 1990s, it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of attention to it. Nobody's opposed to religious freedom, but it doesn't seem like it's one of the major issues that there's a lot of hearings on, there's a lot of money for. So I wonder what you think the reason is for that, if you agree with that.
Well, before I answer the question, if I could ask a clarifying point on that, how would you define operationally a policy on religious freedom?
Pretty broadly. So whether it's developing a bilateral, contacts with people, either from your embassies or from Congress, are you setting aside money to promote programs for international religious freedom, interfaith dialogue? I have a very broad approach to it.
Okay, I don't disagree with that at all. The challenge, I think, let me start with this. I think one thing that's very important is that the ambassador for religious freedom should be at full ambassadorial rank and have the ability to deal directly with the senior leadership in the State Department. There's kind of a growing trend in the executive branch that's been going for several administrations, but I think where we saw it most pronounced from a diplomatic standpoint was in the announcement. I have a friend who actually works in the State Department, and the Cuba desk was never informed by the White House that they were in treaty negotiations with the Cuban government. And I go back to my interagency issue I talked about before. That's a problem, and having at least some degree of consistency in how dialogue and outreach is going to take place from a formal level. It doesn't have to be bureaucratized, but at least from a coordinating level, I think would be helpful. One of the challenges in the Congress, and I think this is what keeps it relatively generic in nature, is you have different schools of thought, and I would say three. One is indifference to anything outside the country unless it directly affects American citizens and to both parties. And then the second and third are more of a viewpoint that one takes a hard line and two takes the line of seeking tolerance and dialogue. At a international or at a national diplomacy level, you could look at the two schools of thought in a relationship with China. The hardline school that essentially begins with the presupposition that China must and will be an enemy of ours under any circumstance, and therefore that colors their view of the world. And there's another group I was part of called the China Working Group that actually had some very accomplished national security professionals in it among the membership, but of those members were more focused on beginning what I would call business dialogue, understanding first principles, building personal relationships to lead to next steps. And I go back to the prior question that with folks like you all on the phone who are very credible professionally, is building this network of relationships that transcends party lines and also working with key staff is worth its weight in gold in the long run in order to bring things around to a more specific area. Because as we've seen, if Congress chooses to have a very high-profile hearing on a subject that may disrupt other efforts, whether it's from, formally from the administration that are, let's assume, the right efforts in one case, or in the other case could disrupt efforts for an organization like IGE or one of your organizations working in a foreign country because you get that stamp put upon you. And that's a concern that I genuinely have. I think that probably the best course in the, from a hearing standpoint is not trying to paint the people into a box who you're trying to build a diplomatic relationship with or establish religious freedom, and better to take a lower key approach to that, just because of the way people perceive administration and Congress internationally is largely one and the same.
Thank you. Our next question, I do not have a name affiliated, so if you are calling in from the number 415-786-2961, your line has been unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. This is Mona Malik. I am the Vice President of the Assyrian Aid Society of America and preparing to join Dr. Seipel in Erbil and Duhok next week to help distribute aid to over 2,000 families. And I believe this is Dr. Seipel's third trip. This is my second trip. Last time I was there was 2010. As an Assyrian Christian, my question to you, Congressman, is how can what is your advice for us to bring more awareness to our plight? Obviously, the Kurds have a large lobby. The Yazidis are becoming more well known. We have tried to advocate and lobby for Assyrian Christians. There is a letter that was just written and signed by 17 congressmen to John Kerry regarding our plight. This is the first time I've even seen the term Assyrian used for our community, which is a great step. It's wonderful. It's urging, the letter from last Tuesday is urging John Kerry to please find ways to work with the persecuted minorities, among them the Assyrian Christians. How can we do more of that? What's your advice?
Well, I think that you've made a breakthrough certainly on cutting through that noise level that's very, very intense on Capitol Hill. I would say in general, and the Congress is a reflection of the society, I'll make a parenthetical statement. One of the things that always troubled me deeply, I went to every military funeral in my district for a young person that was killed in the war and met with their family and, to show support. And leaving those events, I'd often literally walk right outside the cemetery or the funeral home of what was often very high profile in these small towns, and people were going about kind of to and fro, completely indifferent to what was happening if they weren't personally connected. Sorry for the noise in the background. There was an attack terrier going after the mailman. And in the same way, in dealing with these issues, it's all very far away. It's simply a soundbite on the news to most folks, and especially even the policymakers on the Hill. It's something far away unless it comes an issue of that can appeal to their personal compassion, which most people, when they get the facts, will adapt to that if you can get their attention. But I think while you're maintaining those efforts and outreach, and certainly if you email Christy or one of the IGE people, I'd like to see a copy of that letter if possible, and I'm happy to be in contact with anybody on the call regarding, ways to enhance dialogue. The other thing that I suggested in addressing this, and I told Chris about this after coming back from the last Istanbul conference I was part of that the Swiss did back in October, I spoke to a number of Salafi leaders, and some of whom were affiliated with Muslim charities that were actually doing charitable work, and as opposed to funding other things. And I shared with them, because they constantly were asking me ways to facilitate dialogue in the West, and the imams, the sheikhs who were talking were speaking about organizations like IS, Jabhat al-Nusra, what the Assad regime is doing, how that crosses all lines of basic human respect and dignity, and certainly violates biblical and Quranic principles. And I said to them, building on some things that Chris had already started working on in Herbal, that I felt very strongly that for the Muslim community, Muslim leaders in the Middle East, to build a dialogue, they have the same stereotype, typical problem that we do. They view us through a filter just like our people view them. And I wanted to have dialogue with civil society, and I explained to them that you don't need to have dialogue there. You need to have dialogue with people who have equally strong conviction and are followers of God as you. Though there are admittedly serious theological differences, that dialogue can build a space to make real progress. And I said the most tangible aspect of that, where I think that we could help the persecuted people groups, is if the Muslim community is in front of this and actually stands up and funds these humanitarian efforts as well. And I think it would build a tremendous amount of credibility this way as well with policymakers to remove some of the stereotypes. Now, the jury's out on whether that's actually going to happen on any serious scale, but I think that becomes a very critical piece to this. But I would personally, if you wouldn't mind getting us connected through IGE, I'd like to learn more about ways to be part of this dialogue and to assist.
Yes, absolutely, and we will definitely get that letter to you, Mr. Davis. It looks like Ms. Hyun-Soo does have a question again. So, Hyun, you have been unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your insights with us today. And my question is that, let me say that I'd just like to hear your perspective on the cooperation between the State Department and the military on religious freedom issues, religious freedom and human rights issues in other countries. I've been following religious freedom situation in Vietnam, Customer Vietnam Program Officer at ICE, and there are a lot of people out there saying that the U.S. government needs to integrate religious freedom and human rights advocacy in military to military cooperation between the U.S. and Vietnam. So, I just wanted to hear your perspective on that. Do you see that the cooperation between the military and State Department now is good enough to promote religious freedom in other countries? If yes, how should they do that? And if no, then why?
Okay, a little bit of your questioning was garbled. So if I don't answer your question correctly, if it would be possible to unmute her and or if someone could clarify. But the question was on military cooperation with Vietnam, with a number of the other issues that are ongoing. I would probably draw a case study example from the last 20 years of the Soviet Union. And there was a conscious move in the mid-1970s to establish, I was a cadet at West Point at the time, and being indoctrinated that you never talk to your enemies. We all viewed the Soviet Union through a rather negative filter, just as I'm sure our counterparts did to us there. In a comprehensive diplomatic outreach that spanned first the Carter administration and then the Reagan administration, there were a series of outreaches between the United States and the Soviet Union that ranged from intercultural outreaches with the arts, athletic competitions, and military cooperation that ranged from people simply getting to know each other to also athletic competitions among the military training schools, the officer training programs like West Point in the United States and one of the many Soviet military schools. Well, there was some degree of controversy over this issue, and the reason for that is we were involved essentially in proxy wars with the Soviet Union in a variety of parts of the world at the time with a great amount of tension, incredible amount of nuclear tension, and it was very paradoxical. And the diplomatic center of mass, if you will, focused, cooperation means many things to many people, but basically finding a way to connect people to people to have a conversation and to tear down stereotypes with the idea of moving towards common ground for policy. At this time, I remember, again, I was a new Christian at the time, there was a lot of objection to some of this dialogue in the American evangelical church because of the persecution of Christians and the persecution of Jews that was taking place in Russia proper at the time. That said, the cooperation did not take place in such a way to enable further persecution, but it was understood that the end goal was to minimize that in the long run. And I think that it was largely successful in reducing it at the time, but the nature of it was very imperfect. I know that Vietnam is very complicated, and never having been there, I'm not a person that would speak as an expert on that area. I would have to defer to Dr. Seipel and to his staff in terms of interpreting that on the inside. But as I've talked with former diplomats about what Chris is doing, one in particular, a very senior State Department retired diplomat who's a Vietnam Army officer, found it to be one of the most amazing things that he had heard about, because it was slowly following that same model to build dialogue and to open that space up for religious freedom. So that would be my hope, but I have to confess I'm not an expert on Vietnam specifically to share about that.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Xian, did that answer your question?
Part of it, I still wanted to ask again about your perspective about cooperation between the State Department and the U.S. military to promote religious freedom.
Okay. And I'm having a little bit of problem hearing you through the conference line, and so if I don't get this right, we can always correspond via email too. There is an ongoing dialogue on ways to improve the delivery of service, if you will, from diplomacy through technical and military support. And I think that it comes down to a very pragmatic level. If we put, for example, this is probably stretching the question a little bit, but when I was in Afghanistan on my first visit as a congressman about 10 years ago, the person who was in charge of agriculture policy at the time was one of my classmates who was a reserve officer who had been brought to active duty. This officer's background had nothing at all to do with agriculture, was a manufacturing operations and quality manager from the Northeast. And because of her strength of character and resilience and being a good leader and organizer, she made something out of that. But I can't help but think that a more expeditionary or outgoing professional coming from the Department of Agriculture or a corollary program with professionals from the private sector that were identified by the various agencies to participate in these kinds of international efforts would have been dramatically more effective. The other side of what happens when a military unit is put on the ground to do non-military functions, particularly when there's a requirement for security, is that every soldier that is dealing with an agriculture issue or a public works issue or an education issue has to be protected by another soldier. That means there's one less person, or it reduces the amount of operational force to secure the area and can have a negative effect. This was a constant problem that we ran into in Iraq as well. And forgetting all the politics surrounding our entry into the war, that could be its own 5 or 6 conference calls. But where I saw this really firsthand was through the eyes of friends of mine that I had literally grown up with in the military who were just struggling to secure their communities, to command their units effectively, in the face of a lack of coordination between the agencies. And when you got on the frontline level in organizations called provincial reconstruction teams, where there would be State Department people, contractors, and active military trying to work together, if you will, being kind of the municipal services wing of local government, they could often get things done, but the lack of personnel, especially in the State Department, what we found was, particularly by early 2007, that officers and senior non-commissioned officers were being detailed from the Air Force and the Navy, because the Army and Marine Corps was at full capacity with those deployments, but they were being detailed over to the State Department to perform non-military functions. And that, I think, is probably one of the biggest illustrators of the problem. It's controversial because there are agencies within the Pentagon that do not want to give up their control or jurisdiction, and to do this properly would require congressional legislation. The last time that major legislation was passed on defense reorganization alone, let alone the interagency, was in the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act. And the first seeds of that were planted by Congressman Ike Skelton in 1979. That said, it took the Marine Corps barracks bombing in 1983 in Lebanon, and then subsequent to that, the small war in Grenada, which revealed a tremendous lack of coordination among the services at all levels, from communication to technology to personnel, to move to really try to restructure the way we did things. And there's a strong feeling across the diplomatic and military community that needs to be done again. But again, it's the political challenge is getting to 218 votes, something that can pass the House and pass the Senate, and then in turn have a president that will support it. And it's going to take presidential leadership to fix that problem. I've talked to 2 presidents about this, and a common thread that several of my longtime comrades who've done their doctorates in this area have said is every administration comes in and thinks they have it handled, that the problems were the other guy before. President Reagan did that. President Clinton did that. President Bush most recently did that, and objected to these things. And then when I asked the new President Barack Obama about this specifically as the chairman of the caucus in the House, he told me they had it under control. And it isn't by any means whatsoever. It's a constant challenge that I think places people unnecessarily at risk and leads to uncoordinated actions. And that doesn't mean it has to be approved at every level of government. Rather, I think developing that ethos of empowerment and streamlining the organization is the way we would streamline a healthcare organization in the private sector, or streamline a business to be most efficient and add the most value for the lowest cost, is the direction that we ultimately need to go. And where it's the most, I think that where you would see it the most is in the area of defense spending. We spend more than any country in the world many times over. And there are many ways to be able to reduce that and maintain the same level of readiness. And part of that is reorganizing how we do what we do. But if you'd like to talk about this further, or anybody else on the call, I'm happy to do that at your leisure.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we just have one more participant question, and this one is going to come from Mr. Michael Hoyt for his second question. So, Mike, go ahead, please.
Congressman, there's a book called The American Gospels written by John Meacham. It's an excellent overview of the way that religion has been used in our United States history. But he makes a comment here near the end of the book that says, religion as a force in the affairs of nations must be managed and marshaled for good, for faith will be with us, as the scripture says, to the end of the age. It's a great quote, but my question is, how would you see the ambassador at large for religious affairs playing a role that's instrumental and speaks to either the Congress or the State Department in this process of managing or marshaling faith for good?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind are the words of Jesus in John 32 that if you obey my word, then you're really my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And I think that the toughest thing in politics and diplomacy is finding a pathway to the truth that it will have a positive change effect, and building the bridge for that. And my hope for a religious ambassador would be not in a strident tone, and frankly, my hope for all of our elected officials as well, but in a tone of humility, be able to share the truth in such a way that it's doesn't demand a strident conclusion. And again, I don't want to sound weak-willed on this. That's not the case at all. But I think that in many ways we bifurcated our foreign policy by essentially taking a hardline position, and then in another wing of the government taking a much more conciliatory position, and the immediate accusation is that conciliatory position is weak. And it reminds me of Paul's admonition against slaves to slaves to seek your freedom if you can, but not to rebel against your earthly masters, and to show the love of Christ by your service and by your character and your attitude. And I know that gets very nuanced at various times in history, but I think ultimately that motive becomes an important part of the dialogue that's often missed. I would hope that the next ambassador for religious freedom, and especially the next administration, would have strong convictions that would reflect the kind of center of mass of the believing nation of the United States. By politics, that would likely make that person a Christian. I would err on the side of probably an evangelical Christian, and then be honest about the presupposition and the basis for belief. I think one of the things that, I went to college and served in the Army and was told over and over, you can't express your faith, your reality. And I found that not only in diplomatic situations, but also in political situations, if I was transparent about who I was, not preachy, but understood that there were underpinnings to my worldview, particularly when we're connecting with religious issues in these other countries, I think that it can bespeak a sincerity that can, it's hard to articulate, but can cross a bridge. And the one space that I've seen that absolutely in spades, in a broader perspective across the Middle East, were the experiences that I've had with Chris in dealing with the Salafi leaders. I mean, it was nothing short of transformational to me. And so I think in that vein, that becomes a very important part of the dialogue. I don't mean to go on the same subject, but the motive of the heart becomes ultimately the ultimate empty, I think.
Well, thank you, Geoff, for this really important conversation and for all of the great questions that were asked, but especially as religion and religious freedom takes on a more prominent role in public discourse, both in the U.S. and abroad. And thank you to our callers for joining us today. I hope you will join us again on our next Faith and International Affairs Conference call on Thursday, February 26th with Jed Birdsall, former U.S. diplomat and founding chairman of the Forum on Religion and Global Affairs. Jed will speak on the topic of Obama's religious freedom record, which Jed claims is not as bad as you think. We'll let him explain his reasons for making the statement next month. Thank you all, and thank you, Geoff, again.
Thank you.